Well, let's begin. So, Natasha, we thought it might be interesting. The topic today is how human services organisations work, again, but public policy and the role of legislation and regulation. We thought it might be interesting because people will have at hand the presentation to really just give a couple of examples from our own practice experience.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to start.
Great.
So, the very significant change process that I'd like to talk about, and that I think quite nicely illustrates the role of public policy, the impact on legislation or a change in legislation, and then the impact for service delivery in practice for social workers, is not surprisingly inside the Child Protection Program in Victoria, where there had been, in 1989, the Children and Young Persons Act, legislation that was designed to, in many ways, restrict government powers in relation to children, and to say that what we wanted to do in terms of public policy, what we wanted to do as a community, was to respect the rights of parents to parent as far as possible, and that at the same time balancing that with the rights of children to be safe and well in their families. So that was the existing policy platform, and the legislation introduced a concept of significant harm. That time, I won't talk too much about the history, but to say enough that I can demonstrate the swing away from that.
Sure, yeah.
And the concept of significant harm was one that said it's only where a child meets that threshold, where the situation meets that threshold, that there is such a concern about a child that they may be being significantly harmed, or that they may be likely to be significantly harmed, that the state, the government, can or should be involved in the family. So there was a real sense of families' rights to privacy, children's rights to be with their family if at all possible. And there's a but coming, because the unintended consequence over the 20 or so years that legislation had been in place was that, and many of the critics have written about this, was that it played out in many ways as a parent's rights legislation rather than a children's rights.
Yes.
And there was a concern that children's voices weren't being heard in the process, and that the rights of children weren't being upheld. Long story short, the context more broadly for change was that in almost every other state in the country there had been huge inquiries into the problems of the child protection system, and whilst there hadn't recently been a huge inquiry, there hadn't been one since the early 90s in the wake of the death of Daniel Valerio. There had been extensive negative media coverage. So child protection is often a bad news story, and there was a bit of vulnerability, I think, in the service system in terms of, well, when are we going to be investigated? When's the inquiry? Will it be a Royal Commission? Will it be the Ombudsman? What's going to happen? So there was a sense, let's be proactive. We know that there is some change that's required. We know that there has been too much of a swing, and that we don't think that when I say we, we're talking about the senior policymakers in the sector. And we don't think that we're really doing the best that we can. And then overlaying all of that, there was some theoretical knowledge, or some new knowledge that was creeping in and becoming available, and that was the importance of an investment in prevention, the importance of earlier intervention in the lives of children, and the significance of brain development and brain trauma, and what that meant for service delivery. So I guess to start with the public policy, because that was where the drawing board really, we went to the drawing board as a set of senior policy makers and said, in the best of all worlds, we would have a service system for children and families where there was there were a suite of services, and that we had alternate pathways to come into the service, so that it wasn't a one-stop shop. It wasn't just all about significant harm, but that we were also concerned about where things were becoming a bit shaky or a bit vulnerable, and then we had
that's
another
that prevention
place to go.
side of it.
That's right.
Yeah.
So legislation was drawn up to reflect that thinking, really, and then there's I think there's an argument about whether there was an adequate funding base introduced to really support the new platform, but there was certainly, and I think most would say there's never an adequate funding base.
No,
but a whole bunch of new ideas about different pathways, and so we have child first and child protection. Child first being the arm or the gateway into services that might support and prevent further harm, or support families and prevent a child becoming at risk more seriously. And then we have a child protection gateway, which is intended only for those situations more serious risk.
And before that, all of the referrals went to child protection.
They went to one shop, they went to one place.
So this actually created a different way of actually, as you're talking about options and pathways and managing even the number of referrals that were coming in and where they were going as well.
And that couldn't just be invented in a vacuum. There needed to be specific legislation to allow the acceptance of reports, for example, and for those services to work alongside each other, if you like. I guess the other important point about the new legislation is that they were inside the context of what was known as the Every Child, Every Chance reform. So a real sense of holding the child's best interests at the centre, but seeing the child in the context of their family and their community. So some really strong statements in the legislation about the importance of family connectedness, the importance of stability, and the importance of culture, and some very specific provisions for Aboriginal children. Sections 12 to 14 of the Act talk about the particular considerations in light of the really grave concerns about how things have been managed in the past, and I think we know about that tragic history. So I guess what I'm trying to paint a picture of is the way in which public policy can then inform the development of legislation. And what do we do now? We've got a set of laws, and we've got an organisation that needs to carry them out. In fact, a whole sector that needs to carry them out with the introduction of Child First. And so that required the rewriting of the micro policy and the programs and the processes, what to do and how to do it. And really, I was involved at that time in a statewide training program. So also a rethinking about how we help social workers to think about the work they do. How are they conceptualising their role? And what their job is and what their job isn't. And it was a very exciting time, I think, to be helping people to think about not just catching parents doing things wrong, which is in the worst possible world what an investigation of child abuse and neglect report can involve, but that really the kind of things that we're trying to promote in our program, a holistic assessment and an assessment of need as well as of risk, and looking at what's currently working and what can be done more of.
And I imagine for the staff, and I can remember that time, and I actually went along to an information session held by DHS in Melbourne around that time to really talk about what the implications for the field would be as well. So even those agencies that weren't directly involved in child and family services, what would we need to know about that? And I can remember thinking, I wonder what it would be like to be a child protection worker at the time. On the Monday, here's the job that I'm doing. By the next Monday, my job looks different. Obviously not that simple, but because of the new thinking behind working with children and families, because of the new legislation, my job now is different. I'm in the same organisation, but I'm actually doing different things, and hence the training that you were talking about for them. But I imagine that could be a real challenge for people who have been doing things a certain way for a while, and then they're needing to actually perhaps reskill, retrain, and really think about things very differently because that was quite a big shift in terms of thinking across the community about how do we actually, you know, address a complex issue in terms of child welfare. So, did you notice that staff struggled with that a little bit?
And there was there really wasn't agreement. You know, in a huge workforce. So we're talking about just in the state's child protection system, just over 1,000 people. And in the family services sector, just over 700 people. So there absolutely wasn't agreement. In some pockets, in some regions, in some areas, there was a huge amount of enthusiasm and a real embracing of the change. And I suspect that had in part, that was something to do with the organisational culture in those areas and the leadership in those areas. And we're going to talk a bit more about those things later.
Yeah, which have a huge impact on change.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
In other areas there was perhaps a bit more negativity and things were harder to change, a bit slower, there's a bit of resistance. And I guess though that to whip ahead and then perhaps be interested to hear about the example that you were talking about before. But one of the things that was found over time was that the way that the workforce was structured wasn't necessarily the right way or the best way, if you like, to respond to the kind of challenges that were that the organisation was facing or to meet the demand or the needs. So one of the things that's happened in the last year has been a restructuring, and large organisations do tend to restructure, and they do tend to restructure often and tinker with structure. This particular restructure, which was on the back of a document called The Case for Change, was one inside the Child Protection Service rather than the whole of DHS, because that's also undergone a restructure. Inside the Child Protection Service, it has really tried to deepen knowledge about professional practice, and so it's introduced things like principal practitioners and senior practitioners who have a depth of experience and knowledge, and that they're able to mentor and guide less experienced workers. So some of those ideas came about because in implementing the Every Child, Every Chance reforms, people were starting to say, do you know what, we actually need some more expertise. We need some more case practice expertise in our workforce to be able to really make this work. And to some extent, I think it's watch this space to see how that pans out and plays out.
Just before we move on, I'm curious to know, because you're involved in it at that level as well, often when large change is implemented in an agency, they'll do what the jargon will be a post-implementation review of how that change actually went and how that's, I guess, where that's looking like it's going within the agency. Was that something that happened in DHS?
Yes, there was an evaluation process and project that was commissioned, and I think that essentially the findings were, and it was contracted out to an external company, KPMG. Essentially, the findings were that they were good ideas and that the framework was sound, but that there needed to be some tinkering with the model, and that the workforce structure needed to be aligned with the goals of the program. So that's
which is
really
why
the second wave of change.
It has happened. Great. Well, I talk a little bit about experience I had, and it won't be quite as detailed because that's big change that you're talking about there, which is great. Mine's probably a little bit. It focuses a little bit on how changes in legislation had an impact on the relationship that, as a social worker, I actually had then with the client group that we were working with. So it was when I was working at Centrelink, and social workers were involved with making recommendations to team leaders about whether or not somebody was eligible under the legislation to receive a payment of, trying to think of what it was called back then, it was probably the Young Homeless Allowance, I think. I'm thinking back in the late 90s, early 2000s there. Because obviously with change in legislation, all the names change as well, don't they? So at that particular time, social workers would interview a client And we would say, make a decision and recommend, well, we wouldn't make a decision, we would make a recommendation to the team leader that under this particular section of the Act, we felt in our professional knowledge that the client would be eligible for the payment. But the team leader actually made the decision, and the team leader wasn't the social worker, they were the team leader of the income security area within Centrelink, or DSS Centrelink, it was kind of in that crossover phase. And they may not agree with us, and they didn't then have to make the payment if they didn't agree with us. So in some ways it was quite good, because we had a relationship with the client then where we could go into bat and we could advocate for the client. So we could go back to the team leader and say, well, actually, and put another case forward. So we could keep working on behalf of the client. And then there was a change to the legislation that actually meant that the social workers became the delegated decision makers. So rather than being the recommenders, we actually held the decision making power in relation to that same payment. So that we would interview the client, we would make the decision. And in some ways that sounded really good, because it was great. We don't have to argue, and you know, with the team leaders, you know, and sometimes you kind of get a little bit, your nose would get out of joint a little bit, because you've done all this great work around this report, you're using your professional knowledge and skills, you go to the team leader and they'd say, no, we don't agree. And it was kind of a bit like, well, hang on, we're the professionals here. So so in some ways it was great, because we didn't have that extra level. We could use our professional skills and our knowledge and make that decision. But it really changed the way that we actually were able to work with the clients, because we actually then were the people that were saying no often, and we were saying no because of this. So then we didn't have the same role in terms of advocating and going forward with them. We could give them all of the information around appeals and their rights and that, but because we were the decision makers, we actually didn't have that same relationship with them. So on the one hand it was great, but on the other hand it just gave us a bit, maybe it was the power, you know, we had a bit more power in that particular relationship, so it just shifted the power base, and then the way the clients related to us, and really the way that we were able to work with the clients.
So it's complex, isn't it?
It is.
A little bit of be careful what you wish for.
Exactly. Look, I really do think that is the case, that because, you know, we were frustrated for years about the other, and then when we actually finally got the direct decision making power, it was like, hang on a minute, I'm not so sure we want this now, but of course you know, there was no going back from that, and we were still able to obviously work in a respectful way and to be clear about this is our role in this matter, but it did actually shape the way that we worked with the clients. So it can be big change, and it can be some of that more subtle change that can really have an impact on the role of the social workers in the organisation.
And they're interesting things to think about.
They are, for sure.
Thanks, Natasha.
Thanks, Lynn.